Hey everybody, welcome to Improv FAQ. I'm James Quesada, and in this episode, we're going to talk about the principle of yes and. Covering this topic is probably long overdue because the idea of yes and is almost certainly one of the first things you're going to come across in improv training. And in this episode, we will talk about the meaning of yes and, why it's such a popular and powerful rule, and some additional ways to think about yes and how to use it. So what does yes and mean? It means agree with the ideas of the people that you're playing with and build on their ideas. And in turn, they will do the same for you. In the world of improv, we are playing make-believe, using our imaginations and pretending that all sorts of things are true that aren't actually true. We're making things up as we go along. And in every moment, there's a million, billion, trillion possibilities of what could happen next. And the only way to really move forward is for someone to make a choice. And if you have two people on stage and one person makes a choice to say, I am king and this is my kingdom, the other person could make things difficult and say, nah, that's not my favorite idea. Let's keep making our way through that list of a million, billion, trillion possibilities and find something that I like. Or they could make things so much easier by just saying, yes, you are the king and I am your squire. Yes and means play along. Now, the most important thing to remember about yes and is that it's a teaching tool. It's a way to take the very nuanced and layered process of improvising and boil it down to a two-word mantra. It also attacks one of the biggest hangups that most adults have when they go to learn improv, which is that we've been wired to say no, to criticize the function and practicality of ideas, and to protect our egos from participating in things that might make us look foolish, and to proceed with caution whenever we're unsure about a situation. Yes and helps us recondition ourselves to say yes, to assume that every idea is brilliant. We're doing exactly what we should be doing. We're in this together and everything is going to work out great. Once we get through this initial training and strip down some of the gunk and reflexes of adulthood and find our footing for acting and imagination, yes and becomes a little lacking and even a bit misleading. We don't want all of our dialogue to sound like, yes, you are the king and I am your squire. Yes and also applies nicely to things you say, but what about things you do? And surely our characters can't agree with each other all the time. For intermediate and advanced training, it's helpful to unpack the concept a little more, maybe even to as many as 3 words. One nice alternative to yes and is another phrase that opens up a few more possibilities with the same spirit behind it, which is I know because. If your scene partner says, we're on the moon, you might say, I know, because we promised ourselves that someday we'd make it to outer space. It's only slightly different from yes and, but I know because focuses more on assuming you already know what's going on and pushes you to explore why. And it sounds at least a little bit more natural to the way that people actually talk. Whether it's yes and or I know because, the underlying principles are the same. It's paying attention, accepting, and building. You have to make sure that you're not in your head thinking about what to say next or planning out ideas for the scene. Be present, really listen and pay attention to what your scene partner is saying and doing. And when you're fully listening and paying attention, you can fully accept the truth and the reality of what's being said and done, which doesn't mean that your character has to like or agree with what's going on. They just have to live in that same reality. The king said, I am the king and this is my kingdom. And at face value, we can accept the truth of what was said. This is the king and it is his kingdom. But why would he say it that way? Maybe he's upset and putting his foot down about an argument or a rule that you broke. And in that case, you might not be getting along at that moment. It's okay for characters to disagree as long as the players, as people on stage, aren't disagreeing about how we're going to play make-believe. And finally, building. which basically comes down to pulling your weight in the scene and proving that you were listening and paying attention. You've accepted the reality of what's going on, now build on it. What else can we learn about what's going on? I am the king and this is my kingdom might lead to, my lord, please forgive me. I will never throw a party in the throne room again. And now we know something that we didn't already know. It acknowledges the reality from your scene partner and builds on it. In this case, with a choice that you made about why the king said what he said. Yes and is also most useful in the beginning of a scene, which is not to say that halfway through a scene it's time to start ignoring each other and breaking reality. It just means that yes and is about getting on the same page about what's going on in a scene. And once you're on the same page, it can be helpful to shift gears and find more specific ways to play in the world that you built. Another great complementary phrase to yes and is if then. Once you've done all the heavy lifting of figuring out what's going on in the world of the scene, you might start asking yourself, if this is true, then what else is true? Again, only a slight difference from yes and, but with a focus on creating patterns or a through line out of the things that you have learned so far in the scene. If my character threw a party in the throne room, then the throne room is probably a mess. And if there's a pair of underwear on the throne, then people probably got naked at the party. There are so many ways to talk about the idea of paying attention, listening, accepting reality, supporting and building on that reality, that eventually you'll just want to sum it all up by saying yes and. That's it for this episode. Hope you found it valuable. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. And go ahead and leave a comment if you have follow-up questions on the idea of yes and, or if you have suggestions of other questions that you would like to have answered on Improv FAQ.